Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me for the next half an hour. This talk is called Classics and Game of Thrones, Hows and Whys, and I'm very excited to share it with you in this statewide Tjcl convention. So thank you all for being with me, and I hope you enjoy. I'm gonna share my screen now, so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. My contact details are on the first slide, and you can contact me either by email or by Twitter, and I would love to hear from you, whether in response to this talk or just in general. Okay, so Game of Thrones, which I hope you guys have heard of, is a huge phenomenon, and like all fictional worlds worth bothering with, is a place with multiple histories. Some of these histories are native to it, and others are those that we find in it, its relationships to the literary and cultural histories of our own worlds. So today I want to talk to you about two things. One is how we go about finding the classics in Westeros, and the second is why on earth should we, and sort of by what right do we go looking for it to begin with. I have three answers that I want to suggest to you today for the question of how do we find antiquity in Game of Thrones. And note that I didn't say where, though I suppose that's another way to look at this question, but I have a reason actually for asking how instead of where. Where, I think, implies that something is out there waiting for you to find. And if you spend enough time really carefully looking for it, then you will in due course find this thing that is waiting out there. Well, Game of Thrones isn't really like that. If you want to find classical antiquity there, you'll have to bring at least some of it with you. And it's up to you, therefore, to determine not just what kind of thing you're going to find, but also how you go about looking for it. There's not, that's not actually a small responsibility. That's quite a substantial thing. And we'll come back to the whys of that in the end. But for now, I want to focus on what it is that we could bring with us when we visit Westeros as trained or aspiring classicists. So what are the three ways? So one is to think about history, another is to think about story and storytelling, and the third is to think about information and how it circulates. Now, the classical world is a big place. In its widest expanse, we're looking at a landmass, or kind of a land mass plus a sea mass, that is roughly the size of the continental US, over a period of time that spans thousands of years. It contained a vast number of people, cultures, political regimes, languages, religions, and ethnicities beyond the traditional big two of Greece and Rome. For reasons of time, however, I'll confine my remarks mostly to Rome, just because I'm a Romanist myself, and we'll cycle back to Greece at the end. But you can multiply examples here to other traditions, whether in the ancient Mediterranean or beyond. You can bring to Game of Thrones whatever baggage you want. And I'll come back to that as well. Now, I'm assuming you know the basics about Game of Thrones. And you should know that while I don't think there are major spoilers in this talk, I can't promise you a safe, spoiler-free environment. I'm not going to tell you who won, but that's just about it. But just in case you haven't caught Westeros Mania and you want to start binging it or re-binge it or something like that. But other than that, I'm assuming that you are kind of reasonably up to date. All right. So if you watch any Game of Thrones at all, and probably if you haven't, if you've just kind of been near a TV in the last 10 years, you've heard about the Wall. The Wall is the most ancient thing in the Seven Kingdoms, and it's the only structure in Westeros proper that is explicitly inspired by a Roman building. Let me see if I can move my head over here so it doesn't get in the way. It's the only building in Westeros that is explicitly inspired by a Roman building, which is the much less impressive Hadrian's Wall. which Martin tells us, it was on a visit to that wall that Martin could imagine a Roman soldier straining to hear the rustles of what went beyond the end of the world. The wall in Westeros was built by Brandon the Builder, a distant ancestor of the Stark family. And the Starks are in some ways the most Roman of the Westerosi great families. They're loyal to crown and country. They're honest to a fault. They have a developed sense of family and family traditions. So here is the Barberini torso. The two busts are not imaginous, they're not death masks, but we do think that they're ancestral masks. And then on the other side, we have Arya and Sansa with the statue of their father in the background. But it's very much the same sort of dynamic of ancestral veneration. So the Starks also lead by example. They're stoic almost to a fault. And that's pretty much the way the Romans thought of themselves. And it's also what the Romans wanted everyone else to think about them as well. So actually, the Romans were just as happy to cheat and steal as anybody else. The Romans were so successful in perpetrating this myth of Roman honesty that in Polybius, we find the following description of the character of the Romans. The consequence is that among the Greeks, apart from other things, members of the government, if they are entrusted, with no more than a talent, though they have 10 copies and as many seals and twice as many witnesses, cannot keep their faith. Whereas among the Romans, those who as magistrates and legates are dealing with large sums of money maintain correct conduct just because they have pledged their faith by oath. Whereas elsewhere, it is a rare thing to find a man who keeps his hand of public money and whose record is clean in this respect. Among the Romans, one rarely comes across a man who has been detected in such conduct, which is as good a PR kind of brand as anybody can hope for, because it's so very, very obviously not true. So at the opposite end of the Roman spectrum, of the Westerosi spectrum, we find a very different sort of family, the brilliant but unstable Targaryen dynasty. Now, the Targaryens came to Westeros as conquerors, though they are themselves fleeing the doom of Valyria. And this brings me to my first place to find classics in Westeros, which is most straightforwardly in its antiquity. We don't know much about Valyria, but what we do know quite resembles the Roman Republic, an empire presided over by a city-state, which in turn was ruled by competing aristocratic families. The Targaryens are one of those families, and they are, of course, not the only thing that survives the doom. The physical remains of Valyrian empires were scattered all over Essos, and we kind of meet them in various characters travel in the east. The Valyrian roads still run across the length and breadth of Essos, the equivalents to one of Rome's proudest achievements. Now, I couldn't find a good image of a Valyrian road, but this here is the Poiringer table, a Roman road map. So those are the red lines. And what's nice about this table is that it demonstrates both the extent and the importance of the roads that carried Rome's armies, traders, tax collector, tourism, and so on, just as an illustration of how central roads were not only to Roman administration, but also to the way the Romans understood the world. So in much the same that we remember a road trip by which highways or roads we drove on, so too for the Romans, the roads that led them there are an important part of their geographical imagination. On the more horrific side, we have gladiatorial arenas like the one Tyrion sees in Meereen. And those obviously take their cues from the Colosseum, the gigantic arena built by the Flavian dynasty to host lavish and cruel entertainment for the masses. And the dragon pits of King's Landing were filmed in a Roman amphitheater in the ancient city of Italica, which is incidentally the birthplace of Trajan and Hadrian, which is located about 5 miles north of modern Seville in Spain. And you can see in those two images that it's the same sort of amphitheater. High Valyrian, which is the language they spoke in Valyria, remained a language of culture and erudition in Westeros, just as Latin, the language of Rome, remains in ours, for better or for worse. It is the language of legal terminology. Think about terms like habeas corpus, pro bono, quid pro quo. It is the language of the church. Think about the Catholic Mass. And it is the language of generally pretentious people like me. Not that I speak Latin fluently or anything. So when Daenerys Targaryen reaches Slaver Bay, she encounters the Giscari, and they're a nation of slave that very much resemble Rome's ancient empire. Carthage, so I'm sure you know this, was a Phoenician city, and there it is, right here. It was situated on a promontory in northern Africa, and its location basically meant that Rome and Carthage were sort of glaring at each other over the water in direct competition over control of the lucrative trade routes and minerals of the Western Mediterranean. Rome and Carthage fought 3 wars, the First, Second, and Third Punic Wars, imaginatively named, until the Romans finally defeated the Carthaginians once and for all. An apocryphal tradition tells us that to keep Carthage from rising again, the Romans plowed the land around the city with salt. Now, we know they didn't really do that. We know that's apocryphal, but it's exactly what the Valyrians did do to their long-standing rivals, the Giscari. History repeats itself, but with a twist. These Carthaginians, the Giscari, outlast their Romans, the Valyrians. So Rome very much resembles old Valyria, buried in the past of the known world, with significant traces reaching forward to the present: monument, language, some literature, and so on. However, and here we're starting to shade from history into storytelling and mythography, there's another city it very much resembles, and that is Troy. The fall of Troy in Game of Thrones is cinematic. David Benioff, one of the 2 showrunners of Game of Thrones, also did a play called Troy back in 2004. This perennial myth are, depending on who you ask, questionable. Although I enjoyed Troy myself. But he does deserve credit for one of the very few cinematic appearances of Rome's best beloved hero, their mythical ancestors, the one and only Aeneas. This is not a very good slide, but I think it's a screen capture. But this, despite its poor quality, is the very slide I start my Roman history class with, because however schlocky the scene is, and Orlando Bloom had just given Aeneas the sword of Troy, saying something like, "As long as it lasts, so do our people." The scene captures exactly the moment that the Romans insert themselves into history. And it's quite a view as well. The original Aeneas, the Greek Aeneas, Homer's Aeneas, doesn't know anything about Rome. But this Aeneas, Benioff's and the Romans and our Aeneas, he knows exactly what his job is: to leave the burning city of Troy, lead his people to safety, and build a new home and new life for them on the shores of the river Tiber, where in the fullness of time, they can fulfill their destiny and become Romans. And this is one of the many, many, many reasons why you should read Virgil's Aeneid, because it famously helps you get jokes in movies. But anyway, what does this have to do with Game of Thrones, you ask? Well, fair enough. So if Valyria is Troy, then the Aeneas story is also the story of the Targaryens, and of 2 Targaryens in particular. First, Aegon the Dragon, the founder of the dynasty, who crossed the water from a doomed burning city to find a new home for his people at considerable cost to the local people of Westeros. And now, Daenerys Targaryen, who lives out her own Aeneas story in trying to do exactly the same thing. Find a new home in a mythical land she knows is her birthright, but which she doesn't really know or understand. And here she is at the head of her 1,000 ships. So we have nice shades of Helen of Troy as well, and perhaps intriguingly also of Agamemnon, who pulls the ships together to destroy an enemy fortress. Agamemnon famously dies in his bath, killed by his wife, who stabs him. And if you've watched Game of Thrones all the way to the end, you know there's an interesting part as well. And what I want you to notice with all of this is the interesting gender play. Here has a female descendant as well as the traditional male ones. Now, like Aeneas with his Sword of Troy, a Hollywood version of Aeneas's Penates, or household gods, and here they are on the Arapakis. There we go. Daenerys too has to bring a token of survival over from the old country to the new. That's why she has dragons. Rather than just superior air power, the dragons, like the Penates, represent something fundamental about the old and now lost world, and about the people who used to live in it and their relationship to the new nation. The Penates are what connects Rome and Troy, and in fact, they're what makes Rome into a second Troy, an identity complex that the Romans spent quite a bit of time both celebrating and worrying about, but one which also explains why Valyria can be both Troy and Rome, because they're the same, so long as this one token of the past is carefully kept and brought along to the present. Now, the story of Aeneas is depicted in about 1,000,001 versions. Here's one of my favorites. And so this is a caricature of Aeneas carrying Anchises and leading Ascanius by the hand. It's from Campania, and the fact that they're puppies, I think, just kind of makes it better. But the most famous one is one that I've already mentioned, the one that influences years of Western literature, Virgil's Aeneid. And it's an epic poem which takes our hero from the fall of Troy to the early days of settlement in Italy. Now, on the way, Aeneas and Daenerys have any number of similarities. They both have a tendency to blunder. They both have a casual attitude to the opposite sex. They both have a father figure that keeps sending them in the wrong direction. And they have children or care responsibilities who behave in problematic ways and land everyone in trouble. But they're also very different from each other, just as Daenerys is ultimately quite different from her ancestor Aegon and any Targaryen that came before her. Though the show's ending handily problematizes that idea, and the flack that the showrunners caught, I think, is a good example of that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google fan backlash Game of Thrones finale, and it will tell you in prurient detail. So my point is that these stories, rather than just being alternatives of each other, sort of books laid side by side, as it were, are more like sheets of tracing paper messily piled on top of each other. They are each an imperfect repetition of the others, and the changes can be exactly as significant as the similarities. So our second way of finding antiquity in Game of Thrones is in its storytelling, which has much in common with ancient conventions, especially with the conventions of epic poetry, which repeat a fairly limited repertoire of scenes and characters. Someone is always, for instance, off on a journey, but there are endless variations of the same theme. Now, we can multiply examples. We can, for example, talk about duels and heroic fighting in Game of Thrones and ancient epic, which is sort of how I first came to the topic, because I was curious about whether Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, had anything to do with Virgil's Euryalus and the tradition of beautiful young men dropping like poppies when they die. And if you're curious, I have a chapter about this in my book, You Live or You Die, The Ancient World of Game of Thrones, which I'll shamelessly plug here. But what I want to do is build on this storytelling flexibility by way of moving to my third point, information and its circulation. I'm sure you've noticed that I've been using the title Game of Thrones as a shorthand for an entire media phenomenon. Purists, however, would be right to point out that Game of Thrones is the name of the HBO TV adaptation, of a series of books called A Song of Ice and Fire, of which Game of Thrones is just the first book. That's not technically a problem, except that A Song of Ice and Fire, the books, and Game of Thrones, the media phenomenon that consists of books and shows and comic books and spin-off merchandise and a whole industry of fan-driven wiki lists, that's quite a mouthful, including some very, very serious Wikipedia articles, is in fact a very loosely connected galaxy of phenomena. They're all notionally about the same thing, and technically J.R.R. Martin has authorship rights and final say over almost everything. But the books and the shows and the comics and all the rest of it in practice have different authors, different audiences, and different ideas about something as simple as what happens next. The overall frame is consistent. Everybody has Starks and Lannisters, for example, and Ned Stark always has his head cut off. But the details differ, and sometimes quite dramatically. We are also now in the odd situation of the show ending before the book series, and we're still waiting to see what happens in Winds of Winter, the last book in the series, should Martin ever finish it. Fingers crossed. Anyway, this multiple authorship makes for some interesting classical overlaps. In the 5th season of the show, for example, Stannis Baratheon, one of the contenders to the Iron Throne, and not generally a very feeling man, orders the burning alive of his daughter, Shireen. The scene is generally considered one of the most horrific and gut-wrenching episodes in an already horror-soaked show. Not only because it depicts the senseless sacrifice of a little girl by her own parents, which is bad enough, but because the scene is not, or I guess not yet, part of book canon, and therefore not really necessary to film. The scene, as many have already pointed out in detail, is inspired by a scene written by the Greek playwright Euripides in a play called Iphigenia in Aulis, which is set when the Greek army is assembling in Aulis in preparation for crossing the sea for the Trojan War. The details here line out pretty well. 2 armies stranded by the weather, 2 generals fretting over their military campaigns, 2 daughters burned and sacrificed to appease the weather and allow things to get going. To confirm our suspicions, and I'm borrowing here from the excellent Amanda Marcotte in Slate, when Shireen is let out, she is clutching a stag figurine. And you can see it in that picture there. Now, the stag is the symbol of House Baratheon, but it's also perhaps a reference to an alternative version of this myth, where Iphigenia is saved by the goddess Artemis at the last minute and replaced by a great stag. And you can see it sort of in the back on this Apulian mixing vessel. And the sort of storyline of the alternative myth is then developed by Euripides in Iphigenia in Taurus. So we have here a classical reference, which is clearly manufactured by Benioff, who originally wrote the scene for Troy, rather than by Martin himself, and which is now locked into the Game of Thrones canon, whatever else happens or doesn't happen in the books. It's possible that in Winds of Winter, season 5 is about where the show begins to outpace the books, Shireen will in fact be sacrificed. But if she does, I don't see how that scene won't have a lot of TV canon written back into it, so famous or notorious has it become. My point is that Game of Thrones has now reached a state where credit and authorship are fluid and fungible. There are lots of different official versions in circulation, each for a different author and a different audience. In this circulation of parallel and overlapping texts, Game of Thrones has only one parallel in antiquity, and it's a pretty good one. It's the Homeric poems, the Iliad and Odyssey. Tradition had it that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by a blind poet named Homer. Here it is. And this poet produced a poem of such genius that he single-handedly gave birth to literature as we know it. Obviously, there are cracks in this story. And we now think that Homer is better seen as a label for a whole tradition of storytelling centered on the war in Troy and on Odysseus's voyage home. That tradition took shape over many years and millions of repetition. And so in other words, the Iliad and the Odyssey have a legion of authors, group of traveling bards called the Homeridae, who performed parts of the poems for various occasions and patrons. They improvised, they elaborated, they expanded and changed until the text was eventually canonized, written down and more or less fixed in the 6th century BC. Game of Thrones is undergoing the same process but in reverse. A unitary text by a single author is expanding and multiplying, with multiple authors contributing multiple versions and interpretations, and multiple editors, networks, fans, Martin himself, making lots of little tweaks to the overall fabric. What the final result will be, I don't know. Technology and consumer habits suggest that the HBO version will be the one people remember the most, though individual miles may vary. Ancient Greece was a very fractured place, and the Homeric epics were one of the few genuinely collective experiences that unified everyone who saw themselves as Greek. To a lesser degree, the same is true of Rome and Virgil, and it is kind of also true of Game of Thrones as well, which is one of the last truly communal TV events in a time where customization is changing how and how quickly we consume culture. You might not remember, but the Disney model of shows like WandaVision used to be natural, right? You turned on your TV every Tuesday evening to see a half-hour installment of your show. And then the next day, everybody talked about it. Game of Thrones is the last sort of big instance of that kind of communal experience, and we'll see what happens next. But in this too, Game of Thrones is but the most recent phase of an epic tradition reaching from Homer to our present day. It doesn't always look the same, but it keeps on nevertheless. So that's the hows. I promised you some whys, though, and in some ways, I think the why is more important than the how, because answering the why question helps us align our practice as classicists with our values and our visions for what classics can and should be. So here they are. Why should you find classics in Game of Thrones? 1, because why not? And 2, because you can. And if you can, then you should. So let's start with why not. I don't mean to be facile when I say why not. There's an interior design principle that says that if you put something you love next to something else that you love, say leopard print and fuchsia stripes, it will be beautiful. Now, I don't love Game of Thrones, at least not as much as I do leopard print or fuchsia stripes, but I enjoy it. And if you enjoy it too, why not combine that with your love for or enjoyment of the classics? The result is kind of bound to be beautiful because at a minimum, it will engage the principle of pleasure. It will be fun, and fun is always a good thing in my book. The other advantage of putting two things you like next to each other is, and sort of seeing what happens, especially when one of those things is Game of Thrones, which is new and popular, and maybe not always the most intellectual thing you can watch on TV. And the other is a discipline of classics, which is old and niche, and generally speaking, takes itself very seriously and is taken very seriously by various important bodies like college admission committees, is that the juxtaposition invites us to ask some really searching questions about our aesthetic sensibilities and about our ideas of canon and our ideas of what a classicist is and what they do. So let me give you an example. I talked about Daenerys as a female Aeneas figure. And one of the most notable things about Game of Thrones is its depiction of women, both as powerful and as central to the plot, and at the same time as victims or survivors of perversive sexual harassment and sexual violence. Now, rape and sexual assault is everywhere in Greco-Roman mythology, so much so that it often goes invisible. These voices are now being recovered by for instance, by these three books here. But as a general rule, classical antiquity itself gives us little access to the trauma of women. And it's too easy for us to forget to be uncomfortable when, say, Persephone is forced to marry Hades, who very much ignores her screams and take her down to the underworld against her wishes. Game of Thrones, on the other hand, gives us too much access, if anything, too much gratuitous violence. The show has caught a lot of very justified flack for it. But there is nothing really in Game of Thrones' treatment of women that would not have been visited 1,000 times over on the population of Troy, for instance, or any other captured city in antiquity. So when Daenerys offers us a female Aeneas, one who has been trafficked as a child and who has had a much less sheltered existence than the son of Venus before the arrivals of the Greeks, she also offers us a way to understanding ancient epic in a way that ancient authors, I'm thinking here of Virgil's Andromache in Aeneid 3 or of Euripides' Hecuba and the Trojan Women, only begin to sort of skirt around. But in order to gain that access, in order to let Game of Thrones help you read classical epic, you have to begin by being comfortable reading both side by side, which means being comfortable bringing your specific experience as a TV watching young person to the table as a valuable critical tool. From here, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to bringing your whole experience to your study of the classics. And that creates a virtuous cycle. When you bring yourself to classics, classics brings itself to you. So that's my number one why. My second reason is related, and that is that the study of classics makes for a richer life. Maybe not richer in money terms, but certainly a more enriched life. Now, I want to offer an important caveat here. Classics isn't unique in doing this. And we enrich life not because we classicists enrich life, not because of our history as the so-called fountain of Western civilization, but because, like many other majors, Asian studies, French, linguistics, what have you, we offer the opportunity to challenge yourself doing something that is difficult, that teaches you valuable skills, and that allows you to practice problem solving at a high level. So if you graduate from your classics major, or even if you just finish high school with sort of a good understanding of Latin and of antiquity, the question then becomes what you should do with this. What should you do with your education? And note that I said should and not could, although as it happens, the answer to both is the same, absolutely anything. But especially put your skills and knowledge in the service of making the world a better place. And Game of Thrones is not in fact a bad place to start. While Westeros is a fictional world, it is also a complex one and a problematic one. And commenting on complex and problematic fiction is excellent training for commenting on reality, which, as you guys already know, positively abounds with complexities and problems. The same is true for the classical texts and artifacts we study, but what Games of Thrones gives you is a convenient bridge between the tools and techniques you learn in the classroom and how these same tools help you analyze the so-called real world, right? So let's look at a quick example. Cersei Lannister, there she is one of the most interesting women in the Game of Thrones world. And there are lots of interesting things we can say about her as a classicist. We might start by noting that while she is an important protagonist in the story of Game of Thrones, she's not heroic, either in the colloquial modern sense, by which I mean that she's not a morally upstanding person, nor especially brave, nor prone to self-sacrifice, or inclined in any way towards the common good, nor in the technical sense applicable to ancient epic, with its focus. In that she's neither a martial military protagonist nor a semi-divinized figure. Her story is really more properly one of tragedy, with its focus on the claustrophobic confines of the royal court and of court scheming and sort of backstabbing. And I'm thinking here specifically about Clytemnestra, a woman Aeschylus famously called androbolos, man-hearted. Now, being man-hearted is itself a fascinating observation in a world where being mannish is rarely meant to compliment a woman. Given that both Cersei and Clytemnestra are ruling queens, Sorry about the rustling. So given that both Cersei and Clytemnestra are ruling queens, it's also an observation that especially calls for unpacking right now, when women come to the fore more and more as political officers and as political participants, and when we increasingly see what obstacles women face when they are kind of taking up their place in the public sphere. Now, Greek tragedy offers all sorts of fascinating metaphors here. Clytemnestra kills her husband in his bath. Medea kills her children and flies away on a dragon. And both these things technically could actually happen in Game of Thrones. But what I find more relevant is the arc that Cersei, and for that matter, Daenerys, trace as they grow into their power. They're both women in a man's world. They're both willing to act drastically and without remorse, and their stories, like those of most women in this saga, are those of rewriting masculine roles and acquiring powers more usually reserved for men. As power shifts in King's Landing and Cersei struggles out from under the power of her husband, her father, her uncle, and her brothers, she increasingly begins to abuse her power until she reproduces, whether she means to or not, the tyrannical conduct of her son, Joffrey. Now, this might seem like a criticism of women in power. When women get responsibilities, they start drinking, behaving irrationally, getting people killed, and so on. But in fact, there's more to it than that, because this is essentially a masculine, or more precisely, masculinizing plot. Cersei's development requires that she behave in increasingly masculine ways. And in the course of doing so, she is also responsible for some of the great atrocities in Game of Thrones, the explosion of the Great Sept, which remained until the show's penultimate episode, the deadliest event in the series, exceeding in body count any of the big battle pieces. And that is quite an impressive achievement. When women go wrong, actually, is when they are trying to behave like men. Now, this isn't to say that the other paradigm is perfect. More feminine women like Marjorie Tjcl also get in trouble, but my point is that thinking about classical paradigms in Game of Thrones is actually thinking about the stories we tell and how, and I'm borrowing a phrase here from one of my favorite organizations, the Op-Ed Project, the story we tell becomes the story we live in. Literally all the things I mentioned here are things regularly lobbed at women, either in real life or, as you can see, in fiction, bringing the classics, as you can see in fiction, full stop, bringing the classics into conversation with a massive phenomenon like Game of Thrones is just another way of interrogating these stories, of exposing where they come from, what they really say, and what damage they can do, and to begin thinking about mitigating that damage. Now, I said I only had 2 whys, but actually I lied. I'll sneak in a third. Part of the damage these stories do is to classics itself. As a discipline, we're right now engaged in some self-reflection about what we teach and how we teach it, and who we teach it to. The aim of all this ultimately is to write a new story about what classics is and whom it serves. And I, for one, think Game of Thrones could be and should be a part of this new story, precisely because by any technical measure, it's not in any way a classical work. What do I mean by this? As I said before, I don't think classics is anything special, but I do think it teaches you a lot of skills that are good for you. And especially, I hope that it empowers you to intervene in your world and your communities, bring the lessons of the past to all the things that are relevant to you. If you do that, classics grows as well and stays relevant for yet another generation. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. Please let me know what you thought. My contact details are still on that first slide, and I'm sure Amy will put them in the blurb. I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much for spending this time with me, and I hope you have a great JCL meeting. Thank you, and have a great day.